Spooked while camping in Stanislaus. After reading a thread on scary camping experiences, I wanted to share something that happened to me and my girlfriend 2 years ago. We were both in our late 20s. Thinking about it still makes my skin crawl and my heart pound. Sorry if it's a bit long. I want to set the scene appropriately. We camped for the night in the Stanislaus National Forest near Big Trees, California. We were only about 15 minutes off the main road, but in a pretty remote area. Basically dirt fire roads and nothing but trees in all directions. We arrived in the early afternoon and set up camp in a nice clearing at the top of a hill beside the road, and drank some beer while we cooked dinner. We saw maybe 4 cars go by in the hours between when we arrived and nightfall, all hunters leaving the forest. By 7, the sun had mostly set and it was getting dark. The solitude and peacefulness of the woods was nice, but it felt just a little odd being so secluded. I've been camping probably 50 times, but I've always been with a larger group or at a dedicated campsite. After dinner, when it was dark, we hung a bear bag with all our foodstuff and smoked a joint laying back on a blanket, looking up at the stars. I was feeling good and pretty much forgot about the fact that we were alone in the middle of the forest. We got into the tent and sat in the darkness and talked for at least an hour. I'm a tall guy, but my 2-man tent is high enough that I can sit up inside of it without a problem. The rain fly was laying on top of the tent, kind of flung over the top, but not attached or stalked down, fully covering one side and draped over so that the other side was mostly unobstructed. We had a clear view out of the mesh siding, and the trees were barely illuminated by the moon in front of us. Here's where it got spooky. I've been doing a lot of browsing on Reddit, and decided to tell my girlfriend about Reddit 3 Kings, basically a sub dedicated to this spooky ritual where you sit in a darkened room at 3 a.m. and set up a candle and 2 mirrors, and through some combination of supernatural forces and sleep deprivation, images appear in the mirrors and speak to you. I was having fun scaring her, and to be honest, was scaring myself a little bit. My hair is standing on end as I recall this. The woods were dead silent, and there was absolutely no wind. Nothing rustling, no air moving at all. It would have been very easy to feel even the slightest breeze, sitting like we were. I paused in my story, and as I did, the rain fly started to ever so slowly draw back from the top of the tent. It didn't fall off, it wasn't blown. Honest to God, it was as if someone was carefully pulling it down from behind us. I will never forget the sound it made. We turned and stared at each other wide-eyed, and my heart was in my throat. The fly continued to slide ever so slowly down the tent until it was completely off. It was too dark to see clearly behind us, but my mind conjured all the nightmarish beings I've seen in horror movies ever. I like to say I sprang into action and ensured our safety, but I was literally frozen. What a feeling! We sat in stunned silence for maybe 10 seconds, until I found myself to grab my flashlight and look behind us. There was nothing there. We breathed a sigh of relief and started whispering feverishly, "What the fuck do you..." I got out and looked all around the clearing, but felt stupid after a while, and we went to sleep. The next morning, we woke up early and packed up camp. It was sunny and quiet, and I was happy to be in the woods, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that there was something from the night before. I was on my knees rolling up the tent, but kept glancing through the trees around us kind of compulsively. And my girlfriend was packing a breakfast about 30 feet in front of me. Again, there was no one around, absolutely nobody, and no birds chirping or animals in sight at all. Then, I heard from directly behind me 2 thick twacks. Thok, thok, loud, and about 2 seconds apart, like the sound of an axe hitting a tree. I judged the source of the sound as within 100 feet of me. My girlfriend sprang up. As I wheeled around to look behind me, there was nothing there. We both decided it was time to get out of there, and left in a hurry. My heart didn't stop pounding until we were back on the main road. I've never been so thoroughly spooked for such an extended period in my life. I hope this story was interesting to some of you here. Let me know if you have questions or thoughts. Black Road Chance. This is my first time posting on the sub. but I've lurked quite a bit. I have a number of personal experiences I could recount, but this is hands down one of the most terrifying. Where I live, the pines cover a decent part of the state. My father lived in a more remote area at the time, within this area forest, and so taking back roads was the way to get to his house. My brother and I would visit him every other weekend. This happened to be a summer I had my own car, and my brother had previously been picked up. I had errands to run that day, so I would join up with him later. Well, it was later, nearly 10 p.m. There was a particular road that stretched a couple miles. No streetlights, no homes, barely traversed. 2 lanes for traffic coming and going, and only dense woods on either side. My phone was on speaker, sat on the passenger seat, as I spoke to my best friend about my long day at the factory. I'll call my friend Jenny. I had my windows pulled up since 1, it was a particularly chilly night. 2, I wouldn't be able to hear my friend and vice versa. And 3, even if I wanted to roll my side windows down, there was a wood block I had to keep in the door panel to keep the glass from sinking and shattering. Yeah, my car was old. Anyways, I was the only one on the road at the time. I had to stop Jenny from talking for a moment, since I started to hear very quick, whispery, and faint, undistinguishable sounds. I thought my ears were playing tricks on me. I tried to make sense of what I was hearing and backtracked. Not too long ago, I heard a couple of motorcycles in the distance somewhere. Those sounds faded into the night and didn't bear any similarity to what I was hearing right then. Rattles started to meld into the sounds I was already hearing. I didn't really know what to make of it at all. Even though I believe in the paranormal, I always try to inject reason into what I'm experiencing first. I'm not one to scare easily. As I was trying to figure it out, an overwhelming sense of dread covered me in waves, and suddenly what I was hearing grew more distinct, sounding more to me like chants with a layer of another garble of noise. Jenny asked if I was okay, and even though my heart was racing and I felt uncomfortable, I calmly answered with, "Yes, I was fine." Something told me not to look into rearview mirror though. I held out for a little while, but I wanted to see if I had not been alone in the road. When my eyes flicked to the mirror, I panicked. Big time. I can only describe what I saw to the right in the back seat as half of a very ashen white, nearly featureless face with a gaping black socket where an eye was to be, barely a bump of a nose and no mouth. The scream that ripped out of my throat was like nothing I'd ever heard come out of me. I forgot all about Jenny. She was yelling back at me, asking what was going on, but all I could do was scream, get out, and hit the gas. As if that would help, right? That ominous heavy feeling persisted and intensified. Somehow my mind switched from panic to an intense focus on getting myself the fuck out of there. I don't remember the rest of the trip, but the next thing I knew, I was at a stoplight half a mile from my dad's. Open fields with tree lines looming in the distance were on either side of me. I was glad to be off of that suffocating road. Fear still sat in my chest, though it was much more subdued by this point. Jenny's voice came over the phone questioning. I told her I was fine. Just didn't know what the hell had just happened. I described my experience to her and was soon pulling into my dad's driveway. I was shaken, withdrawn into myself when I stepped into the house. My dad was, of course, concerned. I told him about the chance and that face, thinking he wouldn't believe me. Surprisingly enough, he just watched me with a contemplative stare and nodded, told me to get some rest. He was surprised and glad that I didn't run my car into a tree. I was surprised myself. Always respect indigenous culture. Hi guys, I'm fairly new to Reddit, but I've been lurking around Reddit Paranormal long enough that I thought this story might be of interest to some people. I promise this is all genuine. I've done my best to limit embellishments and tell everything factually. This happened 10 years ago or so I am a little fuzzy on some of the details, but I've noted that where necessary. So when I was 15 years old, way back in 2006, My best friend Michelle, her parents, James and Laura, and some family friends, Janet and Trevor, invited my friend Emma and I to spend a week with them at this place called Grindle's Hut. Grindle's Hut is a cottage in the middle of the Volga-Thunagaman Ranges National Park, about 7 hours drive from Adelaide, the capital city of South Australia. It's actually a cottage next to a tiny hut built by stockman John Grindle back in the early 1900s. Now more on him later. Her family had stayed there a few times before and said it was absolutely stunning. One place they were really keen to revisit was Bunyip Chasm. The photos I've been looking seems amazing. Unusually colored rocks, ferns, and waterfalls all around this narrow chasm deep in the bushland. Again, more on that later. That far north, it's all dirt roads. We were driving a 4WD station wagon, rugged car, but didn't have much clearance. While Janet and Trevor drove a Land Rover, which was far more ideal for the terrain. It was the middle of winter time, so heavy rains had turned large sections of road into muddy slip and slides, and a few creeks along the way had flooded, covering the roads. We managed to get as far as Igawarra, this brilliant Aboriginal Culture Center campsite, run by the people there. The park ranger came through and said the road ahead was almost unpassable, and they had to close it for safety. So, we decided to rent a couple of cabins at Igawarra and waited for the roads to dry up. I'm so glad we did, because it was honestly one of the best experiences of my life. During the day, we went on bushwalks to cave painting sites, and at night, there'd be a big bonfire where we sing songs and hear traditional stories. Some of it was a bit trying, though. On the first night, a bus full of Aboriginal foster kids rocked up. We were told by their teachers and carers that we're all problem children who had been in the foster system for a while, constantly being handed on by families who could not handle them. We did feel sorry for them, though. They clearly had hard lives, but in all honesty, for the most part, they were horrid little shits. These kids were all 7 to 12 years old, constantly screaming, fighting, and using swear words I'd never even consider using even now, and they were not afraid of anyone. They completely vandalized the public areas of the campsite, trashed the games room, and broke everything. The camp staff were surprisingly cool about it. I expected them to go ballistic. They sat all the kids down and told them off, obviously, but the kids just laughed at that. However, despite being little hooligans, they did have an appreciation for country and Aboriginal culture. One of the stories we learnt around the campfire that first night was about an evil spirit man. It had a name, but I had no idea or have no idea how to spell it. We all learnt about him in a fun little song written by one of the elders. The lyrics were about walking home at night and having the spirit man following you, so you start running or he'll curse you. Typing that out is actually super creepy, but somehow the song was still fun and a bit silly. That first night, none of us got much sleep, because the kids were all up screaming and carrying on, but the next day, they had gotten out on a private bushwalk with some of the elders, and they came far more solemn. I was taken aback. They told us they learned secret things they couldn't tell us, white fellas, and all of a sudden, they didn't think the evil spirit man was so funny anymore. That night, they were all quite well behaved. A few tried staying up late and being silly, but the rest would shush them, saying the spirit man would come. They seemed genuinely afraid. The change in their behavior was so noticeable, I started to get a little worried myself. One of the people that lived there said that the most important stories is about the rainbow serpent Akura, who is responsible for creating the land and animals. Now, the story talks about how Akura came down from the ranges to drink all the water in Lake Frome before returning to rest in Bunyip Chasm. This was really interesting to us because Bunyip Chasm was on the top of our list of places to visit. Now, as most people would know, the Aboriginal people are deeply connected to their country, and there are often many sacred places that need to be respected or treated with care. for the people that lived on this land. Bunyip Chasm is one of them. I'm ashamed to say, I don't know the traditional name for the site. We ended up spending 3 days at Igawarda. When we left, we mentioned that we wanted to visit Bunyip Chasm, and the staff got a little funny about it. Again, it is a sacred site, and they take that seriously, as we should have too. They advised us not to go there, but if we did, to be careful. Honestly, the more I think about it, the more frustrated I am that we didn't listen. We're all very open-minded people. Michelle's parents border on being hippies, so we greatly respect Aboriginal culture, but obviously not enough to stop us from going to one of their sacred places, right? Anyways, on we traveled to our original destination, Grindel's Hut. Now, Grindel's Hut is the most remote place I've ever been to in my life. There is nothing out there but endless bushland. I honestly can't describe it in a way that isn't wacky, but there's just something about such ancient, untouched Australian bushland that's deeply moving. It feels so empty, but also so incredibly full of life and energy. It can honestly be a little overwhelming if you open yourself up to it. I nearly had a panic attack when I spent too long thinking about how far away from anything we were. The only building nearby is a ranger station. We stopped in there to collect the key and register ourselves in. You have to let them know where you're going and what you're doing, and when you'll return in case something happens and they have to come find you. Again, we mentioned we planned to go to Bunyip Chasm, apparently, though it was fairly well advertised as a popular hiking trail or place of interest, but we saw almost nothing about it on our way up. The ranger said they decided to stop advertising it because there had been quite a few accidents. Obviously curious, we asked her more about it. Now, just a few more background details here to help you paint the picture of the whole situation. The chasm is a few kilometers up from Grindel's Hut. To get there, you drive your car to the end of a dirt track to a place called Loch Ness Well. Then you have to walk about 3 hours up a gorge through the creek bed until you finally reach a dead end with only a narrow path through. This is the beginning of the chasm. I think you used to be able to just walk in, but now there was a huge boulder blocking the entrance. Apparently this does not deter people, and most of them manage to climb over the boulder and get inside. So obviously when scrambling over rocks is involved, there's got to be a lot of injuries, right? First there were a few sprains, a cracked wrist here and there, then a broken leg that required rangers to go in and carry the person out. I vaguely recall hearing about a death at some point, but I'm reluctant to say that that's a fact. Because of all these injuries, they decided to try and make it safer by putting proper ladders inside. 2 tradies went in, and while they were drilling holes to install the ladder, one of them slipped and cracked his skull. That was when it was decided that it wasn't worth the risk, and they stopped advertising it. The ladder was never installed. Michelle's parents are highly optimistic people, so they only found all this curious, while my friend and I were quietly apprehensive, echoing the staff at Igawarda. The ranger recommended that we do not go there at all, but if we do decide to go there, to be careful. The main access to Grindel's Hut is via 4WD track around the gorge that surrounded it, but it hadn't been graded recently, and since the wagon didn't have enough clearance to make it through, we left it at the ranger station, loaded all our supplies into the Land Rover, and Jeanette and Trevor drove in while we made the 11-kilometer approximate trek through the gorge. Just even more evidence as to how extremely isolated this place was. We finally make it to the cottage when the rain comes in again. After all the hiking, we were glad to just stay indoors and read for a day or two. So, this was when we learned the unsettling backstory of the location. So as I said, the cottage you stayed in is built in front of the original hut, built by cattle farmer John Griddle in 1918. Several mysterious incidents had occurred there. I can't remember the full story, but roughly, John's cattle began disappearing. His mule was killed. Then one of the men he hired to help him muster the cattle one year went missing, and was found to be murdered. Grindle was convicted and jailed, but spared hanging. Apparently, Grindel's ghost had been seen around the old hut, which having seen the hut, I do not doubt in the slightest. But aside from getting the creeps from the old hut, I never experienced anything personally. By the time the rain cleared up, and we finally set out for the chasm, I was more creeped out by the hut than all the warnings we'd been given. The walk up the creek bed was beautiful. The rains meant it was flowing in most places, so we had to rock hop for a fair bit, which was kind of fun. There were frogs, birds, and kangaroos about. Absolutely ideal hike, right? About halfway along, we came across another group. They were staying at the campsite back near the ranger station, and had driven in specifically to visit the chasm. Despite it not being heavily advertised, the chasm is still quite well known via word of mouth. We stopped and chatted to them for a bit, and they told us that they didn't end up making it to the chasm because their youngest boy started feeling ill, and they decided to turn back. We wished them the best of luck and carried on. After that, the hike started feeling different. It was probably a combination of the ever-growing cliffs looming over us and the warnings creeping back into my mind, but I no longer felt welcome. Now I know it's just a feeling, but being welcome to a place is very important in Aboriginal culture. Otherwise, you can upset the spirits who will play tricks on you or otherwise try to hurt you. So, we were almost at the end of the creek bed, about 500 meters away from the chasm when Trevor, the family friend, slipped on the rocks and twisted his back. It wasn't too bad of an injury. He could continue on, but being an older man and that far away from help, it was a bit of a worry. Trevor's injury slowed us down for a bit, our pace for a little whiles, but we finally made it to the opening of the chasm. The opening was around 2 meters wide, and exactly as the ranger described, right in the middle was a large boulder about 3 meters tall. It was much bigger than I expected and completely smooth, nothing really to grab onto. Making it even more inaccessible was the large dirty pond at the base of it. Despite the recent rain, it didn't look like fresh water. It had that dark brown color and had obviously been sitting stagnant for quite a while. Leaning across the pond against one side of the boulder was a decent-sized log. Someone had clearly put it there to use as a kind of ramp to help climb over. Michelle's dad was the first to try it. The log looked worn and was slightly damp from yesterday's rain. He slipped slightly and almost got to the top when it cracked and he fell into the pond. The pond is full of rocks, so he got pretty badly bruised. The log crumbled down next to him. By this point, I was certain we were not supposed to get into the chasm. The place basically had a do not enter sign on it. Something didn't want us there, but the adults were determined. We come this far, right? We looked all around for different options to help us in, more rocks, another log, but there was absolutely nothing. Finally, Michelle's dad gave her mom a boost up onto the boulder. She's a tall lady and only just made it up. From on top of the boulder, she sighed. Apparently, there must have been a rock slide, and the inside of the chasm had been filled with rock debris, making it very difficult to get through. It was decided that, even if we all managed to get over, it wasn't safe to continue on the boulder, especially with Trevor's back and Michelle's dad now bruised and soaking wet. I was slightly disappointed, but also quietly relieved. The mood had completely changed. Everyone was a little sullen, and with the sun beginning to set, the gorge seemed gloomy and foreboding. Coupled with the unwelcome feeling, I think we were all ready to head back. Then, not 300 meters from the chasm, Emma suddenly tripped and sprained her ankle. I could not believe it. We had been warned that there had been accidents, but we didn't even get into the chasm, and we had already 3 ourselves. Emma is prone to the dramatic, so I thought she was hamming it up, but it turned out she was actually quite hurt and couldn't walk unsupported. The car was 3 hours away and it was getting late, so our only other option was to take turns supporting her as she walked out. The walk back was grim. You know that feeling like someone is standing right behind you? It felt like that for the longest time. Michelle and I started singing to entertain ourselves, mainly Disney songs because we're dorks, and that really seemed to change the mood. It was probably just a mentality thing, but the general feel of the gorge seemed to lift a little. Maybe whatever forces were around respond well to singing? I don't know. When we got back to the car, it was almost sunset, and the wind had picked up. That was our last night at the cottage, and probably also the creepiest. The wind did not let up all night, whistling around the cottage. Trevor almost had an asthma attack, and he left his medication at home, but luckily, I had an inhaler with me. He kept thanking me for the rest of the trip. A potential attack in the middle of nowhere is pretty freaking scary, I guess. The next morning, we packed up. Emma's ankle was still buggered, but since we had eaten most of the food we'd brought in, we managed to create a space for her in the Land Rover, so she didn't have to walk out. Michelle, her parents, and I set off back through the gorge to the ranger station. After a week of hiking and exploring, we pretty much were done, so everyone was fairly quiet on the walk home. Michelle and I, being younger and slightly fitter, ended up a little ways ahead of our parents. We had just reached the top of a small hill at one end of the gorge, when something made one of the weirdest sounds I've ever heard. Now, Australian animals make weird noises. Cockatoos sound like bloody pterodactyls, but we're all outdoorsy nature people, so we know what animals make. The closest sound I can match it up to is a camel's bellow, but with a small shriek at the end. There are feral camels in Australia, but they're mainly up north. It could have been a feral goat, but we had goats at school and they did not sound like that. It was quite loud and echoed down the gorge, so it stopped us in our tracks. We looked around for a sign of whatever had made the noise, but we saw nothing. We ran back to Michelle's parents and they heard it too. They agreed it was weird and couldn't say what might have made it, but being as chilled as ever, they weren't really fussed about it. It was odd, just like one single cry, like someone yelling, "And stay out," before slamming the door in your face. That was an amazing trip. I learned and experienced so much. But the biggest thing I took away from it all was to always respect indigenous culture. I'm not at all religious and only vaguely spiritual, but I completely believe that the Aboriginals are concerned to the land on a level we will never understand. They know things, and if they say not to go somewhere, it's in your best interest to listen. Third Bridge, Colorado. Hello there. I've posted one experience. Figured I'd post my other true terrifying experiences. When I was younger, my friends and I went through a phase where we were addicted to going to haunted locations in our state of Colorado. This one place in particular, Third Bridge, has left me with some memories I will never forget. I'm going to tell you the two experiences that happened to me that made me a believer. A little background about this place first. My friends and I were researching haunted areas in Colorado that we could go to that weren't too far to drive to. Came across Third Bridge. Legend has it that Native Americans were slaughtered there. Also, teens have died in car accidents at the bridge looking for a scare. You can look this place up to verify the information I'm telling you. To get to this place, you have to take County Line Road basically all the way into the middle of nowhere. Farmhouses are spread out a great distance from each other. No streetlights either, it's pitch black if you turn your headlights off. Eventually, the road turns into dirt, and you take to road until you get to hill. Once you drive up the hill and get to the top, your headlights illuminate a scene straight out of a horror movie. At the top of the hill, you can see the bridge, which looks very old and beat up. It's a concrete bridge that you can tell it's been there for a long, long time. The creek that runs under is completely dried out. The bridge is surrounded by these huge ass trees. They're scary. They look evil at night, if that makes sense. Just being on that hill looking down at that scene, dread just overwhelms you. The very first time my friends and I went to this place was probably the scariest. It was 4 of us in my Toyota 4Runner. We find County Line Road, and eventually make it to where it turns into a dirt road. As soon as the road changed to dirt, we all got this feeling that something bad was going to happen. Like we had made a mistake deciding to come here. We make it to the top of the hill and I just stop. We were all just sitting there looking in every direction, still deciding if we really want to drive down to the bridge. We hadn't been sitting there for more than 2 minutes when I see, at the foot of the bridge below us, a tall dark figure just standing there. I knew it was staring at us. You could feel it. It had no facial features. It was just this solid black figure. You could tell it was a person, though. I looked at my friend in the passenger seat and asked him if he was seeing this right now. All he said was, "Yep," with his terrified look on his face. I looked in the back to see my other 2 friends holding each other staring at this thing. As I returned my focus back to this thing, it started sprinting at us. Once it started running, something was waving on this thing at about a foot level. It was like it's wearing a damn cape. I put that SUV in reverse and got the hell out of there. We didn't even make it to the bridge. After we had told all our friends about what happened, a few others wanted to go check it out, so I smartly agreed to go there again. The couple in the back seat I went with the first time didn't want to go this time. Can't blame them, right? My other friend surprisingly was down to go, so I loaded up my vehicle again with a full crew, and we headed out into the darkness. Now, let's just fast forward to the top of the hill. Fortunately, Shadow Man wasn't there again, so we slowly made out decent down to the bridge. I parked my vehicle on the bridge, turned it off, rolled the windows down a little, and we sit in total darkness. The whole time we had this feeling like we were being watched. Our eyes had adjusted to the dark, and just looking out there was terrifying. With nothing really spooky happening, I turned the car on and drove to the end of the bridge to turn around, so we would be facing the exit in case anything happened, and we wanted to leave in a hurry. So same thing, I parked and turned the car off. We sat there for probably another 10 minutes and nothing happened. I was a bit disappointed, because honestly, I wanted my other friends to see and believe what my other friends and I saw. My friend in the backseat suggested we go under the bridge. Nowadays, I would say nope right away, but I was eager for something to happen. We all got out of the car and make our way to the railing to step over to get to the land under the bridge. We didn't even walk 2 feet when we all heard this blood-curdling scream. It was a woman, and it sounded like she was being butchered. The scream gave out this horrible feeling of dread and of evil. Fear took over my body, and I started to tear up. We all booked it like track stars back to my car and got the hell out of there. Haven't been back since. I dropped all my friends off and went home. I got out of the car and went around my vehicle to do just a quick check of the tires and everything. I got to the back window and there were dirt. I kicked up on the window. And because of the dirt, there were 2 handprints, one on top of the other. It was like the handprint on the bottom was reaching out for the car and something dragged it away. Thanks for reading and sorry for the length. I like to hear other people's experiences of exploring haunted areas in your state. I'm also hoping a Colorado native reads this. Thanks.